Mrs. Hawthorne's hand lingered on mine a moment longer than necessary as she slipped the paper across the cafe table. "You didn't get this from me, Lily," she'd said, her eyes sharp despite the faint tremor in her voice. The address on the folded note felt heavier than it should in my palm. All the way to the edge of town, I kept replaying her warning in my head. "He knows more than you think, but you may not like what you hear." The house stood apart from its neighbors, half swallowed by an overgrown garden. Paint peeled from the siding in strips, and the porch sagged as if tired of holding itself up. When I knocked, the door creaked open almost instantly, as though someone had been waiting just behind it. The man was older than I expected. Hair silver, posture slightly bent, but his eyes were startlingly alert. They locked on mine for a long beat before he spoke. "You look just like her." I hesitated. "Her? Your grandmother." His voice softened, though it carried a weight I couldn't place. Then, without another word, he stepped aside. "You'd better come in, Lily. We have a lot to talk about, and not much time." The smell inside was a mix of aged wood, dust, and something sweet, like a jar of jam that had been forgotten for years. The floor groaned beneath me as I followed him into a sitting room where the air felt thick, almost expectant. He didn't sit right away. Instead, he stood near the mantel, brushing his fingers over a faded photograph. "Your grandmother was unforgettable," he said at last, "even when you tried to forget." I stayed close to the door. "You knew her well?" Daniel, he'd introduced himself briefly, finally turned to me. "Well enough to know she wouldn't want you tangled in this." "In what?" He sank into a worn armchair. "The man in those letters, he wasn't just some old romance. He was tied to dangerous things. Things that could still hurt people now." I felt my pulse rise. "And Alpha? How does he fit in?" Daniel's gaze sharpened. "That's the problem. Alpha fits into this far more than you realize. And if you're smart, Lily, you'll start asking yourself why he hasn't told you." My breath caught. "So he's hiding something from me?" Daniel leaned forward, his voice low and deliberate. "I'm saying the man in those letters and Alpha are the same story. You just don't see it yet." The clock ticked on, the sound filling the silence between us. Then he smiled faintly, though his eyes stayed grave. "When you do see it, Lily, will you still want to know him?" The door closed behind me with a hollow click, leaving me standing on the sagging porch under a sky that looked like it might break open any second. The air was cold enough to sting my cheeks, but my mind was too loud for me to notice the chill. Daniel's voice looped in my head. "The man in those letters and Alpha are the same story." The same story. I walked down the cracked path through the overgrown garden, my boots crunching on gravel. Each step felt heavier than the last. The letterbox in my grandmother's attic, the neat handwriting on the envelopes, the ink faded to brown. None of it had seemed dangerous before. It had been romantic. Mysterious, yes, but not dangerous. And Alpha. Sweet, patient Alpha, who made me laugh when I didn't mean to, who asked about my day like it was the most important thing in the world. Could he really be hiding something this big from me? I paused at the corner of the street, looking back at the house. A thin curtain shifted in the upstairs window. Was Daniel still watching me? Or was that just my imagination feeding on the cold? The wind picked up, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke from somewhere nearby. I pulled my coat tighter and started walking again. I thought about the first night Alpha and I stayed up talking, the way his voice had softened when he spoke about trust. I thought about the way he always seemed to steer conversations away from his past, brushing them off with half jokes or quick changes of subject. Was that charm? Or caution? When I reached the bus stop, I didn't even check the schedule. I just sat down on the cold bench, My fingers curled around the folded address Mrs. Hawthorne had given me. The paper felt like it had a pulse of its own. I could go to Alpha's place right now, look him in the eye and ask him everything. But then, if Daniel was wrong, if Alpha had nothing to do with this, what would I be breaking for nothing? The sound of a bus pulling up broke my thoughts. I didn't get on. I stayed seated, watching it leave, the red taillights disappearing into the distance. For now, I told myself, I would keep quiet. But the silence already felt heavier than the truth. When I knocked on Alpha's door that evening, the smell of something warm and spiced drifted out before he even opened it. He greeted me with that easy smile of his, the one that usually made my guard melt away. Tonight, it didn't. "Hey, stranger," he said, leaning against the frame. "I was starting to think you'd forgotten about me." "I've been busy," I replied, stepping inside. My voice sounded normal, at least I hoped it did. His apartment was exactly as I remembered. Neat but lived in, a few books stacked haphazardly on the coffee table, a soft lamp casting a golden glow over everything. The kind of space that felt safe. Or maybe I just wanted it to feel that way. "What's for dinner?" I asked, slipping off my coat. "Beef stew, thought it might help with the weather." He headed to the kitchen, and I followed, watching the way he moved. He always seemed to carry himself with a quiet confidence, but now I wondered if it was really control. We sat down at a small dining table, steam curling up from our bowls. I kept my gaze on him as I stirred the stew slowly. "So," I began casually, "I was going through some of my grandmother's old things today." He looked up, spoon halfway to his mouth. "Yeah? Find anything interesting?" "Maybe," I said, smiling faintly. "Some letters, from someone I'd never heard of before." Something flickered in his eyes, so quick I almost missed it, but his voice stayed steady. "Your grandmother had a lot of friends, didn't she?" "I guess," I replied, tilting my head. Funny thing, though, the letters were all addressed to her, but never sent. Makes you wonder what kept them hidden. He chuckled lightly. "Not everything's meant to be shared." I let the words hang there between us, pretending to sip my soup while my heart pounded in my ears. "What about you?" I asked suddenly. "Any old letters lying around? From anyone I should know about?" His smile widened, just a little too much. "Only bills. Nothing worth keeping." I didn't push further. Not tonight. Instead, I laughed, asked him about his day, and let him believe I was exactly the same Lily as before. But as he talked, I caught myself wondering whether every answer he gave me was just another well-folded letter, carefully sealed, waiting to be found. After dinner, Alpha offered me coffee, and while he busied himself in the kitchen, I wandered toward the small bookshelf by his couch. I told myself I was just looking at titles, just curious. My fingers brushed over the worn spines, pausing on a slim, leather-bound journal that looked older than the rest. It was wedged between two thick cookbooks, almost like it was meant to be hidden. I glanced toward the kitchen, the sound of a kettle whistling. Before I could stop myself, I tugged it free. It wasn't a journal, it was an address book. The edges of the pages were frayed, some corners folded. Flipping it open, I scanned the handwritten names and numbers, neat but faded with age. I almost closed it, until my eyes landed on a name, Daniel Hawthorne. My stomach lurched. The same man who had looked me in the eye and told me my grandmother's love story wasn't what I thought. The man who had said, "We don't have much time." And under his name, in Alpha's handwriting, was a date. Barely 2 weeks ago. "Find something you like?" Alpha's voice was light, but it startled me so badly I nearly dropped the book. I slid it back between the cookbooks before turning around. "Just browsing." He walked over, 2 mugs in hand, his gaze resting on mine for a second too long. You've always been curious, haven't you? I forced a smile. Guess I have. He handed me a mug, and for the rest of the night, I laughed at his jokes, listened to his stories, and pretended nothing had changed. But inside, I was counting the days since that date in the book, and wondering why Alpha had been in contact with Daniel before I ever met him. The next day, Alpha and I ended up at the little cafe near the market, the one with the squeaky chairs and walls covered in old black and white photographs. We were halfway through our coffee when I decided to try. I leaned back, tracing my finger along the rim of my mug like I was lost in thought. You know, I said casually, someone told me once that my grandmother used to dance barefoot in the rain, said she laughed like she didn't care who was watching. Alpha's spoon froze mid-stir. It was a blink-and-miss-it pause, but I saw it. He set the spoon down slowly. That sounds like her, he said, his voice careful. Who told you that? I shrugged, taking a sip. Oh, just someone who knew her a long time ago. He nodded once, his eyes never leaving mine. I see. We moved on to safer topics, his work, a funny story about the market vendor, the weather, but his answers were shorter now, his smile thinner, and I could feel the invisible thread between us tightening. As we stood to leave, he touched my arm lightly. Lily, if you ever hear things about your grandmother, just remember, people like to romanticize the past. It's not always as they tell it. I gave him a polite smile, but inside I was more certain than ever. Alpha knew exactly who had told me about the rain, and exactly what else they might have said. It wasn't planned. At least, that's what I told myself. After we left the cafe, Alpha walked me to the corner, gave me his usual warm smile, and said he had errands to run. I nodded, pretending to head home, but as soon as he turned away, I slipped into the stream of pedestrians, following a few paces behind. The market was busy at first, full of chatter and clinking coins, but Alpha didn't stop to browse like he usually did. He moved quickly, glancing over his shoulder once, just enough to make me duck behind a rack of scarves. My pulse quickened. He left the main street and turned down one of the narrower lanes where the smell of rain lingered in the air. The houses here were older, the kind with peeling shutters and ivy climbing the walls. Halfway down, he stopped at a gate. An old brass number was fixed above it, the same street Daniel had scribbled on the back of that envelope. My breath caught. Alpha glanced around, his gaze sweeping the street. I pressed myself into the shadows, my heart hammering so loudly I was sure he'd hear it. Then he slipped inside, closing the gate softly behind him. I stood there for a long time, staring at the spot where he'd vanished, until the street grew quiet and the shadows stretched longer. My feet wanted to move, either forward to knock or back to safety, but I couldn't decide which would be more dangerous, because now I knew. Alpha and Daniel's worlds weren't just connected, they were overlapping. I took one step toward the gate, then another. The brass numbers above it seemed to gleam in the fading light, daring me to push forward. But before my hand could touch the latch, footsteps echoed behind me. Quick, deliberate. I spun around. A woman in her late 50s was striding down the narrow lane, her hair pulled back in a severe bun, her coat buttoned up to her chin. Her eyes met mine, and in that instant, I felt as if she saw straight through me. "You shouldn't be here," she said. Not a question. A warning. I opened my mouth, but she walked right past me, unhooked the gate with a practiced motion, and stepped inside without knocking. The latch clicked shut, leaving me frozen on the street. From somewhere beyond the ivy-covered wall, voices rose. Alpha's voice, and hers. I couldn't hear the words, but I could hear the tone. Urgent, low, almost heated. I stayed rooted to the spot, my mind racing. Who was she? How did she know Alpha? And why did she look at me like I'd already crossed a line? The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain. I realized my hands were trembling. I wasn't ready to go inside. Not yet. But I knew, with absolute certainty, that the story was no longer mine to enter quietly. Someone else was already inside it. I pressed my back against the cold stone wall, the ivy scratching at my coat as I slid toward a narrow gap near the corner. The street lamp behind me cast just enough light to outline the shapes inside, but not their faces. The woman's voice was sharper now. "You can't keep putting this off, Alpha. She's already too close." A pause. Then Alpha, low and steady. "I'm not ready to tell her. Not like this." Her reply came like the crack of a whip. "You never will be if you wait for the right moment. There isn't one." My pulse thudded in my ears. "Tell me what?" The wind rustled the leaves above me, and for a heartbeat, I thought they might hear it. Hear me. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing. Alpha's tone softened, almost pleading. "You don't know her like I do. She's not just another curious stranger. She's—" He stopped himself, the word hanging there like an unfinished promise. The woman sighed, the sound heavy with something I couldn't name. "Then you'd better decide, Alpha. Because if she finds out from someone else—" Her voice trailed off, but the unspoken ending was louder than anything she'd said. My fingers dug into the rough stone. A part of me wanted to push the gate open, demand they finish their sentences in front of me. But another part, maybe the wiser part, knew that whatever I heard next could change everything. And that terrified me. The woman's voice dropped to a whisper, too soft for me to catch. I leaned forward just an inch, desperate to hear, when the gravel inside the gate crunched under heavy footsteps. Alpha was moving. I froze, my breath locked tight in my chest. Through the sliver in the wall, I caught the faintest glimpse of his shadow stretching toward the entrance. "I'll walk you out," he said. "No need," the woman replied quickly. "You should go check." She stopped herself, but it was too late. Check what? My mind spun, but my body refused to move. Alpha stepped closer. I could hear the creak of the old iron latch, the metallic scrape as he lifted it. My heart pounded so loud I was sure it would give me away. In that split second, I did the only thing I could. I slipped backward into the deeper shadows of the alley, pressing myself flat against the damp brick. The cold seeped through my coat, my palms stinging where they scraped against the rough mortar. The gate opened with a groan. Light spilled out onto the cobblestones, stretching toward me like it was trying to pull me in. I saw Alpha's head turn slightly, his gaze scanning the street. For a moment, I thought his eyes locked right on mine. Then, "Alpha," the woman called from inside, her voice firmer now. "Come back. We're not finished." He hesitated, just for a second. Then the gate creaked shut again. I stayed there in the dark, my pulse racing, the echo of his voice still curling around me. I didn't move until the sound of the gate latch clicked shut again, sharp as a gunshot in the quiet. Only then did I push myself off the wall, my legs trembling in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. The street ahead felt too long, too exposed. Every step I took seemed to echo louder than it should, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see Alpha following. The conversation replayed in my mind like a loop I couldn't break. She's already too close. Too close to what? And tell her, "Not like this." Tell me what? I shoved my hands into my pockets, curling them into fists as if that might hold me together. The rain had started again, soft at first, but enough to make the cobblestones shine under the flickering street lamps. Halfway down the block, I caught movement in my peripheral vision. A dark figure at the far end of the street. My stomach knotted. The shape was tall, broad-shouldered, familiar. I slowed, pretending to study a shop window, though the glass only reflected the blur of my own anxious face. The figure stood still for a heartbeat too long before turning down another street. I exhaled hard, but it didn't feel like relief. If that had been Alpha, Why hadn't he called my name? The wind picked up, scattering leaves down the empty road, and I pulled my coat tighter. No matter how far I walked, the sound of their voices followed me. His, steady but weighted. Hers, urgent and warning. And the worst part? I couldn't decide which scared me more. What they'd been hiding from me, or the possibility that Alpha had seen me and said nothing. By the time I reached my street, the rain had turned into a steady drizzle, drumming against the hood of my coat. My boots squelched with every step, and the cold had worked its way into my bones. All I wanted was the warmth of my tiny living room and a cup of tea to chase away the night. But then I saw it. A small square package sat on my doorstep, wrapped in plain brown paper and tied with a thin piece of twine. No return address, no name, just there, waiting for me. I stood frozen, water dripping from my hair, staring at it like it might explode. It wasn't unusual for me to get mail. Ever since moving into my grandmother's old house, the postman had been delivering odds and ends that had probably been sitting in forgotten corners of the postal system for years. But this was new. This was deliberate. I bent down slowly, my fingers brushing over the damp paper. It was heavier than it looked, and when I tilted it, something inside shifted. Soft, but with a faint clink, like glass against metal. A flash of the night's conversation hit me again. Tell her, not like this. My throat tightened. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, kicking it shut behind me. The package sat on my coffee table, water droplets beating on its surface. I reached for the twine, hesitated, and then sat back, my hands curling into fists in my lap. I didn't know whether I wanted to open it, or if I was afraid I already knew what was inside. The clock ticked loud in the quiet room, each second stretching longer than the last. My eyes kept darting to the package on the table, its damp paper now darkened in patches where the rain had soaked through. I told myself I would wait until morning. I told myself I was too tired to deal with whatever this was. But the truth was, the not knowing was worse. I pulled the package closer. The twine cut easily beneath the edge of my scissors, curling into loose coils on the table. The paper gave way with a soft tear, revealing a plain wooden box, no markings except for a tiny brass latch. My fingers hovered over it for a beat before I flipped it open. Inside was a stack of photographs, old, curled at the edges, their black and white tones faded to soft grays. I lifted the first one, my breath catching. It was my grandmother, young and radiant, standing beside a man I didn't recognize. His arm was draped casually around her shoulders, his smile easy, but his eyes, there was something in them. I pushed the photo aside and looked at the next. And the next. In every single one, that same man stood close to her, sometimes with a hand on her waist, sometimes holding her hand like it was the most natural thing in the world. And then, halfway through the stack, I froze. Because in the background of one photograph, standing just far enough away to almost be missed, was Alpha. Younger, different hair, but unmistakable. My fingers went numb. The last photo was tucked under the rest, almost hidden. This time, there was no mistaking it. Alpha stood beside my grandmother, looking straight into the camera, and they were holding hands. I didn't sleep that night. The photographs lay spread out on my bed, like pieces of a puzzle I wasn't ready to solve. I kept tracing Alpha's face with my eyes, my mind looping through every conversation we'd had, searching for hints I might have missed. By morning, I'd made a decision. I wasn't going to confront him, not yet. If I pushed too soon, he might shut down, or worse, feed me a half-truth just to keep me calm. So I slipped the most damning photo into my jacket pocket, tucking the rest back into the box and hiding it at the back of my wardrobe. It felt almost wrong, keeping it from him. But I needed time. When Alpha arrived later that day, he was his usual calm, steady self. He handed me a coffee, asked if I'd eaten, and sat across from me at the kitchen table like nothing had changed. But I saw it now. Tiny things I'd never noticed before. The way his gaze would drift when I mentioned my grandmother. The faint pause before he answered certain questions. We talked about mundane things. The weather, the market, some small repairs around the house. But I couldn't focus. Every word out of his mouth felt loaded. At one point, he caught me staring and smiled. "You look like you've got 100 questions on your mind." I forced a laugh. "Maybe I do." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Then ask me one." For a moment, I almost pulled the photograph from my pocket and laid it between us. I almost said, "Who were you to her?" Instead, I sipped my coffee and said, "What was your favorite place to go when you were younger?" He relaxed instantly, launching into a story about summers by the coast, his voice rich with nostalgia. I listened, nodded, even smiled, but my fingers brushed the edge of the photograph in my pocket the whole time. I was smiling on the outside. On the inside, I was counting down to the moment I would finally ask the question that might change everything. 2 days later, I was in the corner shop down the street, picking up flour and tea. Mrs. Hargrove, the owner, was behind the counter as usual, humming to herself as she stacked biscuits on a shelf. When I set my items down, she glanced up and smiled. "Ah, Lily, haven't seen you in here much since you moved into your grandmother's place. How's it coming along?" "Slowly," I said with a small smile, "still finding bits and pieces of her life everywhere." Mrs. Hargrove gave a knowing nod. She was a keeper of things, that one, and people. She chuckled softly, as if at a private joke. "Always had visitors, especially him." I froze. "Him?" Her eyes twinkled. "Alpha, of course. He was practically part of the furniture in that house long before you were born. Your grandmother always said—" She cut herself off suddenly, her mouth pressing into a thin line. "Always said what?" I pressed. Mrs. Hargrove busied herself with the till. "Oh, nothing. Just that he was a good friend to her. Loyal. The kind you could rely on." I tried to keep my voice light. "Did she ever mention how they met?" "She did." Mrs. Hargrove's hands stilled on the counter. She looked at me for a moment, her expression shifting between caution and curiosity. "But that's not my story to tell, dear. You'll have to ask him yourself." I left the shop with the tea and flour, but my mind was racing. Mrs. Hargrove had nearly said something more, something that felt big, something Alpha hadn't told me. When I turned onto my street, I spotted him. Alpha, standing by my front gate, talking to a man I'd never seen before. Their heads were close, their voices low. The man handed Alpha a small envelope, then walked away without so much as a glance in my direction. Alpha looked up and saw me. For a split second, something flickered across his face. Surprise? Guilt? Before his smile returned. "Perfect timing," he called. I was just about to knock. And just like that, my heart began pounding again. The photograph was still in my pocket, the shopkeeper's almost confession still ringing in my ears. And now there was an envelope. Alpha stepped toward me, slipping the envelope into the inside pocket of his jacket with a movement so quick it might have gone unnoticed if I hadn't been staring right at him. I forced a smile. "What's that?" "Just something for work," he said smoothly, as if the explanation had been waiting on his tongue. "Nothing exciting." I raised an eyebrow. "Work? I didn't think you had an office job." His grin tightened just slightly. "I don't. It's complicated." There it was again, complicated. The same word he'd used when talking about the letters weeks ago. I wanted to push, to ask what exactly was complicated, but something in his eyes told me I wouldn't get a straight answer tonight. Instead, I unlocked the gate and let us both in. The air felt thick between us. like we were standing in the middle of a sentence neither of us wanted to finish. Inside, I set the flour on the counter, poured us tea, and tried to act normal. He told me about a faulty motor he'd been fixing and some old friend he'd run into, but it all felt carefully curated, tidy little anecdotes that left no room for the questions I wanted to ask. I finally said, "Mrs. Hargrove told me she's known you a long time, that you spent a lot of time with my grandmother." His eyes softened for a moment, then drifted away. "She was important to me." "In what way?" I asked quietly. He looked back at me, holding my gaze. "In the kind of way I can't explain without changing how you see me." I opened my mouth to ask more, but his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and frowned. "I have to go. I'll call you tomorrow." Before I could say anything, he was already at the door, jacket pulled tight, the envelope still hidden inside. I stood there staring after him, tea cooling in my hand. The unanswered questions piled higher in my mind, about my grandmother, about Alpha, and about whatever was in that envelope that wasn't for me, but maybe should have been. The rain started again just after Alpha left, tapping against the kitchen window in quick, restless beats. I tried reading, tried tidying the table, even tried watching a film, but my mind kept circling back to that envelope. It wasn't just curiosity anymore, it was the way he'd hidden it, the way he'd shut down the moment I asked. I hated feeling like there was a wall between us, and tonight, he'd bricked it up higher. By the time I washed my teacup, I had made up my mind. If he wasn't going to tell me, I would find out for myself. The thought felt dangerous, wrong even. But so did being kept in the dark when the shadows of my grandmother's past were still creeping into my present. The next morning, I left the house early, knowing Alpha sometimes stopped by the garage on the east side of town before work. I parked across the street, pretending to scroll through my phone until I saw him pull up on his motorbike. And there it was, the envelope. He carried it in his hand this time, tapping it against his thigh while talking to someone at the doorway. I couldn't hear their words, but I saw the man take the envelope, glance inside, and then look sharply toward the street, toward me. My stomach tightened. Alpha turned. His eyes landed on my car. Even from here, I could see his jaw set, the easy charm draining from his face. I'd been caught. But before he could come over, the man with the envelope stepped in front of him, saying something low and urgent. Alpha's head snapped back toward the conversation, and I knew I had seconds, maybe less, before one of them decided what to do with me. I didn't get the chance to drive away. Alpha crossed the street in long, decisive strides, the rain sheeting off his jacket, his boots splashing in shallow puddles. I stayed in the car, hands frozen on the steering wheel, because running now would only make me look guiltier. He stopped by my window and bent low, his eyes locking on mine. I expected fury, disappointment, even betrayal. But what I saw was worse. Fear. "Get out," he said, his voice low but urgent. I stepped onto the wet pavement, heart pounding. "Alpha, Not here." He glanced over his shoulder toward the man at the garage, who was still watching us with that unreadable, almost calculating expression. "We're leaving. Now." He didn't wait for my answer. He walked to my car door, slid into the driver's seat and started the engine. I climbed in beside him, too stunned to argue. We drove in silence for several blocks, the wipers beating in tense rhythm. My questions crowded my throat, but his jaw was locked tight, his grip on the steering wheel white-knuckled. Finally, I couldn't take it. "Alpha, what's going on? Who was that? And why?" He cut me off, his voice quieter now, but no less intense. "You were never supposed to see him. If you knew what was in that envelope..." He trailed off, shaking his head. "You'd wish you hadn't followed me." The road stretched out ahead, empty and slick with rain, and my pulse hammered with equal parts fear and need. "Then tell me," I whispered. He looked at me for a long moment before returning his eyes to the road. I can't. Not yet. But you have to trust me. I wanted to tell him trust wasn't a magic trick, that it needed something to hold on to. But before I could speak, he slowed the car and turned into a narrow lane I didn't recognize. The lane dipped into a grove of dark trees, and the shadows swallowed us whole. The tires crunched over gravel until Alpha finally eased the car to a stop beneath a canopy of dripping branches. The rain softened here, muted by leaves, but the air felt heavier, like the grove was holding its breath. Alpha killed the engine but didn't move. He just sat there, staring straight ahead, as if finding the courage to open a door neither of us could close again. This place, he began, his voice low, was where I made the first mistake that changed everything. The way he said it made my skin prickle. Mistake? He nodded slowly. I was younger, stupid. I thought I was helping someone, but I was just feeding a fire I didn't understand. The air between us tightened, like the grove itself was leaning in to listen. I wanted to press him, to demand names, dates, the whole truth. But there was something fragile about the way he gripped the steering wheel, as if letting go would unravel him. I brought you here, he continued, because if you're going to stay in this, stay with me, you need to see where it started. He finally turned to face me, and in that moment, his eyes looked more haunted than I'd ever seen them. What started? I asked. He opened his mouth, hesitated, and then the sharp crack of a branch snapping in the darkness cut through the grove. Alpha's head jerked toward the sound. We're not alone. Alpha's hand moved instinctively toward the door handle, but he didn't open it right away. His eyes scanned the darkness between the trees, every muscle in his jaw tightening. I swallowed hard. Maybe it's just an animal. Animals don't watch you breathe, he said quietly. That sent a shiver rippling through me. The air smelled of damp stone and roasted coffee drifting from the bakery across the square. I wasn't here for bread. I told myself I just wanted to look around, but in truth, I was chasing a feeling, that itch in the back of my mind that told me answers were somewhere close, waiting for me to be bold enough to reach for them. I stopped outside a tiny antique shop, its window cluttered with tarnished picture frames, porcelain teacups, and stacks of yellowed books. The kind of place where memories linger longer than the people who owned them. Inside, it was warmer. The air smelled faintly of cedar and old paper. A bell over the door jingled as I stepped in, and an older woman behind the counter looked up. Her silver hair was swept into a neat bun, and her eyes, sharp, assessing, flicked over me with the faintest hint of recognition. You're not from around here, she said, not as a question but a fact. I smiled politely. Just visiting. Her gaze lingered on me another moment before she reached under the counter, pulling out a tray of small brass keys. Visiting who? It was an innocent enough question, but something in her tone felt deliberate, like she was already guessing the answer. An old friend, I said carefully. She hummed, turning one of the keys in her hand. Tall, dark-haired, always watching the room? My pulse skipped. Maybe. Her eyes locked on mine, steady and unblinking. If you're talking about Alpha, you should know. Men like him don't forget the past. They bury it, and the people in it. The words landed like a stone in my stomach. I opened my mouth to ask her what she meant, but before I could, she smiled, a slow, knowing smile, and turned away to rearrange a shelf of books. The conversation was over. Or maybe it had just begun. By the time I made it back to the house, the rain had stopped completely, leaving the air heavy and clean. The garden glistened, every leaf jeweled with drops of water. From inside, I could hear the soft hum of Alpha's voice, low and steady, like he was speaking to someone on the phone. I hesitated on the porch, letting my fingers rest on the damp railing. My mind replayed the antique shop, the woman's eyes, and that sentence that refused to leave me. Men like him don't forget the past. They bury it. When I stepped inside, Alpha was alone in the living room, leaning over a stack of papers on the coffee table. He glanced up, and immediately his expression softened. "You've been gone a while," he said, setting the papers aside. "Everything all right?" "Mm-hmm." I moved toward the window, pretending to watch the fading clouds. "I just wandered into town, looked around." His gaze lingered on me. I could feel it even as I kept my eyes elsewhere. "You're quiet," he said after a moment. I gave a small laugh, hoping it didn't sound forced. "Just tired." Alpha leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "Lily, you know you're not good at lying, right?" The words made my stomach knot. I turned to face him, but his expression wasn't angry. It was searching, like he was trying to read a book with half the pages missing. "Something happened," he said quietly. "What was it?" For a heartbeat, I considered telling him everything. The shop. The woman. The way she spoke his name like she already knew I was tangled in something I didn't understand. But the truth felt like a loaded weapon, and I wasn't sure yet who it would hurt if I handed it over. "Nothing," I said finally. "Really, just thinking too much." Alpha studied me, his eyes steady and unreadable. Then, without another word, he nodded and turned back to his papers. But the air between us had shifted, heavy with all the things unsaid. And I couldn't tell if he had let it go, or if he was simply waiting for me to slip. That night, dinner felt off. The kitchen smelled of rosemary and garlic, the kind of warm, grounding aroma that usually made me relax. My pillow was still warm on one side, cold on the other, a reminder of how restless the night had been. Alpha's words had stayed with me, curling around every dream and chasing me into the dawn. "You might walk away." I pulled the blanket tighter around my shoulders, staring at the ceiling. I didn't know if I hated him for keeping it from me, or hated myself for wanting to believe he had a reason. Either way, it felt like we were playing a quiet war, one where no one fired the first shot, but both of us knew the battlefield was set. Downstairs, I could hear the creak of floorboards. Alpha was already awake. The smell of coffee drifted up the stairs, rich and bittersweet, like the man himself. For a moment, I considered avoiding him. Let him wonder where I was. Let him taste the same uncertainty he'd left me with. But then I thought of his face last night, the way he'd stood there in the rain, holding back something that clearly hurt him too. I went down. He was at the table, sleeves rolled up, coffee in one hand, his phone face down beside him. When his eyes met mine, there was no smile, no easy greeting, just that guarded expression I'd learned to read as "there's more I'm not saying." "You're up early," he said. "Couldn't sleep," I replied, pouring myself a cup. The silence stretched between us again, only this time it wasn't angry. It was something heavier, something that made me want to lean in and pull him apart until I found what was at the center. But I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I said, "I've been thinking, maybe I should go into town today." His gaze sharpened, like he knew exactly what I meant. "For what?" I shrugged. "Just to look around." He sipped his coffee without breaking eye contact. "Be careful what you look for, Lily. Sometimes you find it." The rain had thinned into a mist by the time I stepped into town. My boots left faint marks on the wet cobblestones, each step echoing more than it should in the quiet morning. The air smelled of damp stone and roasted coffee drifting from the bakery across the square. I wasn't here for bread. I told myself I just wanted to look around, but in truth, I was chasing a feeling, that itch in the back of my mind that told me answers were somewhere close, waiting for me to be bold enough to reach for them. I stopped outside a tiny antiques shop, its window cluttered with tarnished picture frames, porcelain teacups, and stacks of yellowed books. the kind of place where memories linger longer than the people who owned them. Inside, it was warmer. The air smelled faintly of cedar and old paper. A bell over the door jingled as I stepped in, and an older woman behind the counter looked up. Her silver hair was swept into a neat bun, and her eyes, sharp, assessing, flicked over me with the faintest hint of recognition. "You're not from around here?" she said, not as a question but a fact. I smiled politely. "Just visiting." Her gaze lingered on me another moment before she reached under the counter, pulling out a tray of small brass keys. "Visiting who?" It was an innocent enough question, but something in her tone felt deliberate, like she was already guessing the answer. "An old friend," I said carefully. She hummed, turning one of the keys in her hand. "Tall, dark-haired, always watching the room?" My pulse skipped. "Maybe." Her eyes locked on mine, steady and unblinking. "If you're talking about Alpha, you should know. Men like him don't forget the past. They bury it, and the people in it." The words landed like a stone in my stomach. I opened my mouth to ask her what she meant, but before I could, she smiled. A slow, knowing smile, and turned away to rearrange a shelf of books. The conversation was over. Or maybe it had just begun. The rain had thinned into a mist by the time I stepped into town. My boots left faint marks on the wet cobblestones, each step echoing more than it should in the quiet morning. He slipped out of the car first, moving with a cautious, controlled pace. The rain dripped from the leaves overhead in steady taps, like a clock ticking down to something inevitable. I hesitated before following, every step crunching against damp earth. The grove felt different now, no longer heavy with memory, but alert, like it was holding its ground against something unwelcome. Alpha stopped suddenly, lifting a hand to silence me. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Soft, deliberate, and too rhythmic to be random. They circled us, staying just beyond the reach of the dim light spilling from the car's headlights. "Show yourself," Alpha called, his voice echoing off the wet bark. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a figure emerged from the shadows, a tall man in a dark coat, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. His face was obscured, but his stance was rigid, his attention fixed on Alpha. "You shouldn't have brought her here," the man said, his tone more warning than threat. My stomach twisted. "Who are you?" The man's gaze flicked to me briefly, then back to Alpha. "She doesn't know yet, does she?" Alpha's silence was answer enough. The rain picked up, heavier now, each drop smacking against the leaves like an impatient drumbeat. I took a step toward the stranger, but Alpha's arm came out, blocking me. "This isn't your business," Alpha said, voice low but edged. The man let out a short, humorless laugh. "Not my business? You think you can keep the past buried just because you don't say the name?" I froze. "What name?" Neither of them looked at me. "Leave now," Alpha said, his words clipped. "Before I make you regret staying." The man's eyes narrowed. "You always were good at threats, Alpha, but you're not the only one who knows what happened that night." That night. The words lodged in my chest like a splinter. "Tell me," I demanded, my voice cutting through the rain. "Tell me what happened." The stranger turned his head toward me, his face still mostly shadow. "You deserve the truth, but you won't hear it from him." And then, as quickly as he'd appeared, he stepped back into the darkness, swallowed whole by the trees. I spun toward Alpha. "What is he talking about?" Alpha didn't answer right away. His shoulders were stiff, his jaw locked, but his eyes were a storm. "Lily," he said finally, "you need to trust me on this." I wanted to, God, I wanted to, but something in me whispered that trust was exactly what he didn't deserve right now. I stepped closer, feeling the mud shift beneath my shoes, the smell of wet earth rising between us. Alpha, I said, my voice trembling in that way I hated. If you want me to trust you, then you have to tell me what he meant. He didn't move, didn't blink. Only the rain slid down his face like tiny rivers, tracing lines I wanted to read but couldn't. Some things, he said slowly, aren't meant to be dragged into the light. Not yet. Not yet. My laugh came out sharp. Do you hear how that sounds? You think this is your secret to keep, but if it's about you, it's about us. His jaw worked like he was chewing over 1,000 words and trying to swallow them all. If you knew everything, Lily, you might walk away. The ache in my chest deepened. You don't get to decide that for me. For a heartbeat, I thought he'd break. His hand twitched at his side, like he wanted to reach for me but didn't dare. Instead, he stepped back, creating that space between us that suddenly felt like a canyon. I'll tell you when I can, he said, but not tonight. I stared at him, my pulse a wild, uneven drum. Then I'll find out myself. The words hung between us like a challenge neither of us could take back. And as I turned and walked away through the rain, I didn't know if I wanted him to stop me, or if I was daring him not to. I woke to the sound of rain tapping against the window. Softer now, like it was too tired to rage. I woke to the gray light of dawn bleeding through the curtains, the sound of rain soft against the roof. My mind was still tangled in last night's whispers, the name Mara etched so sharply in my thoughts it felt like it was carved there. When I walked into the kitchen, Alpha was already there, leaning against the counter with a mug of coffee. He looked up and smiled, easy, familiar, but something in his eyes didn't match the warmth in his voice. "Sleep well?" he asked, handing me a cup. "Well enough," I said, taking it, letting the steam mask my expression. Though I kept thinking about all the people I've met since coming here. He arched an eyebrow. "Anyone in particular?" I took a slow sip, pretending to think. Maybe. I met someone once, briefly, who seemed to know a lot more than they said. Sometimes I wonder if I should track them down. He didn't flinch, not exactly, but I caught the faintest pause in the way his fingers tapped the counter. "Maybe you should," he said lightly, then turned to rinse his mug. "Sometimes strangers tell the best stories." The moment passed, the conversation slipping into safer waters about the weather and errands, but my stomach was tight with the unspoken. He'd answered me without really answering. By the time I set my cup in the sink, I knew 2 things for certain. 1, Alpha wasn't ready to tell me about Mara. 2, I was going to find her anyway. I left Alpha's place under the pretense of needing fresh air, but really, I needed space to think. The rain had thinned to a mist, curling around the narrow streets like secrets that refused to leave. As I passed the old corner cafe, I noticed a woman sitting by the window, flipping through a stack of photographs. Something about her profile made me pause. It was the same woman I'd glimpsed the night Alpha disappeared into the alley. I stepped inside, the bell over the door chiming softly. She looked up just once, her gaze brushing mine like she'd been expecting me all along, then returned to her photos. "Coffee?" the barista asked, pulling me back. I nodded, but my attention never left her. I caught sight of one of the photographs on the table, blurry, but I knew that face. Mara. The woman gathered her photos quickly, slipping them into a leather envelope, but not before sliding a small slip of paper beneath her cup. When she left, I waited. The moment she was gone, I walked over and lifted the paper. It had only 3 words, "You'll find her," and beneath it, an address. The address on the paper burned in my palm the whole walk home. I told myself I'd wait until morning, that it was foolish to go poking around in the dark, following the breadcrumbs of a stranger who somehow knew my name, my story, and the faces I'd been chasing. But the truth was, sleep didn't come. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the words "you'll find her" replaying like a song I couldn't turn off. By 3 a.m., I was sitting in my car, engine idling, headlights washing over an unfamiliar street. The address led me to a narrow townhouse, its windows dark, its front gate slightly ajar as if someone had been expecting me. My hand hovered over the latch, the night pressing in around me. I could hear my heart in my ears, my thoughts a swirl of questions. What if Alpha was here? What if Mara was? What if the truth waiting inside wasn't the one I wanted? Somewhere deep inside, I knew that once I stepped through this gate, there'd be no going back. I took a breath, pushed the gate open, and stepped forward, and froze when a shadow moved in the doorway. A voice, low and steady, said my name. Lily, we need to talk. But Alpha was quieter than usual, his eyes flicking to me between bites as if checking for something. We sat across from each other, the soft clink of cutlery the only sound. I tried to ignore the tension by asking about his work, his plans for the weekend, anything to pull the conversation into normal territory. He answered, politely, even warmly, but there was a delay in his responses, like his mind was somewhere else. At one point, I caught him staring just a little too long before looking down at his plate. What? I asked, forcing a smile. Nothing, he said, but there was a curve to his lips that didn't match his eyes. You just seem like you've seen a ghost. I laughed softly, shaking my head. Not quite. He speared another piece of chicken, his gaze dropping again. Well, ghosts have a way of following you home if you're not careful. I froze mid-bite. The words were casual, almost playful, but they landed with an unsettling weight. My mind instantly replayed the woman in the shop, her voice, her warning. I swallowed hard. That's an odd thing to say. He met my eyes then, and for the briefest second, something unguarded passed between us. Not anger, not fear exactly, but a mutual awareness that we were dancing around something big. Then he looked away and changed the subject. But for the rest of the meal, my appetite vanished. I couldn't sleep. The house was too quiet, the kind of silence that makes every little creak feel like a whisper you're not meant to hear. I tossed, turned, and finally gave up, padding barefoot to the kitchen for some water. Halfway down the hall, I stopped. A low voice drifted from the living room. Alpha's. It was calm, but edged, like he was choosing each word with care. I moved closer, keeping to the shadows, my heartbeat ticking in my ears. The lamp near the sofa was off, but the faint glow of his phone lit the outline of his face. Yes, I saw her, he murmured. A pause. She doesn't know yet. My stomach tightened. I leaned in, holding my breath. Then came the name. A name I'd never heard before, yet it rolled over me with an inexplicable chill. Tell Mara to wait. I'll handle it. He ended the call without another word, slipping the phone into his pocket and staring into the darkness for a moment, as if he could see something I couldn't. I stepped back quietly before he could notice me, my mind spinning. Who was Mara, and what exactly was he planning to handle? Back in my room, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the shadows on the wall like they might spell out answers. Mara. The name looped in my mind, each repetition heavier than the last. I reached for my journal, the one where I'd been keeping notes about the letters, the post office box, and every strange twist since moving here. My pen hovered over the page as I scribbled, Mara, mentioned tonight by Alpha. Connection unknown. He told her to wait. Why? My thoughts jumped back to the woman at the antique shop, the one with the knowing eyes who had brushed off my questions. Could that have been her? Or someone connected to her? I flipped through older pages, scanning hastily drawn diagrams and timelines. Somewhere between the sketches of envelopes and half-legible theories, I noticed something I'd missed before. On the back of one of the letters, faint, almost smudged into the paper, was a set of initials. MRA. My pulse quickened. I traced the letters with my fingertip, feeling the dent in the paper. It was too much to be a coincidence. But if Mara had been part of this story all along, why had Alpha kept her name from me? I closed the journal and lay back, eyes wide open in the darkness. Every tick of the clock seemed to whisper the same thing. You're closer to the truth than you think. But do you really want it? I woke to the gray light of dawn bleeding through the curtains, the sound of rain soft against the roof. My mind was still tangled in last night's whispers. The name Mara etched so sharply in my thoughts, it felt like it was carved there. When I walked into the kitchen, Alpha was already there, leaning against the counter with a mug of coffee. He looked up and smiled, easy, familiar, but something in his eyes didn't match the warmth in his voice. "Sleep well?" he asked, handing me a cup. "Well enough," I said, taking it, letting the steam mask my expression. Though I kept thinking about all the people I've met since coming here. He arched an eyebrow. "Anyone in particular?" I took a slow sip, pretending to think. "Maybe. I met someone once, briefly, who seemed to know a lot more than they said. Sometimes I wonder if I should track them down." He didn't flinch, not exactly, but I caught the faintest pause in the way his fingers tapped the counter. "Maybe you should," he said lightly, then turned to rinse his mug. "Sometimes strangers tell the best stories." The moment passed, the conversation slipping into safer waters about the weather and errands, but my stomach was tight with the unspoken. He'd answered me without really answering. By the time I set my cup in the sink, I knew two things for certain. 1, Alpha wasn't ready to tell me about Mara. 2, I was going to find her anyway. I left Alpha's place under the pretense of needing fresh air, but really, I needed space to think. The rain had thinned to a mist, curling around the narrow streets like secrets that refused to leave. As I passed the old corner cafe, I noticed a woman sitting by the window, flipping through a stack of photographs. Something about her profile made me pause. It was the same woman I'd glimpsed the night Alpha disappeared into the alley. I stepped inside, the bell over the door chiming softly. She looked up just once, her gaze brushing mine like she'd been expecting me all along, then returned to her photos. "Coffee?" the barista asked, pulling me back. I nodded, but my attention never left her. I caught sight of one of the photographs on the table, blurry, but I knew that face. Mara. The woman gathered her photos quickly, slipping them into a leather envelope, but not before sliding a small slip of paper beneath her cup. When she left, I waited. The moment she was gone, I walked over and lifted the paper. It had only 3 words: "You'll find her," and beneath it, an address. The address on the paper burned in my palm the whole walk home. I told myself I'd wait until morning, that it was foolish to go poking around in the dark, following the breadcrumbs of a stranger who somehow knew my name, my story, and the faces I'd been chasing. But the truth was, sleep didn't come. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the words "you'll find her" replaying like a song I couldn't turn off. By 3 a.m., I was sitting in my car, engine idling, headlights washing over an unfamiliar street. The address led me to a narrow townhouse, its windows dark, its front gate slightly ajar as if someone had been expecting me. My hand hovered over the latch, the night pressing in around me. I could hear my heart in my ears, my thoughts a swirl of questions. What if Alpha was here? What if Mara was? What if the truth waiting inside wasn't the one I wanted? Somewhere deep inside, I knew that once I stepped through this gate, there'd be no going back. I took a breath, pushed the gate open, and stepped forward, and froze when a shadow moved in the doorway. A voice, low and steady, said my name. "Lily, we need to talk."